The sky turned the color of old bruises that Wednesday afternoon in southern Illinois, March 18th, 1925. Frank Morrison stood in his cornfield, dirt still clinging to his work boots, watching the western horizon swallow the sun whole. The air felt wrong, too still, too warm for mid-March, the kind of stillness that made a man's skin crawl. His 9-year-old daughter Helen had run out from the farmhouse, her blonde braids bouncing against her shoulders. "Papa, the chickens won't go in the coop," she called, her voice tight with worry. "They're all huddled by the barn." Frank knew what that meant. Animals always knew first. He grabbed Helen's hand and started running toward the house, but not to go inside. His destination was 50 feet from the back porch, where a pair of weathered wooden doors lay flat against the earth at a 45-degree angle. Those doors led down into 8 feet of hand-dug earth, reinforced with limestone blocks he'd hauled from the creek bed one by one. His storm cellar, the one his neighbors had laughed about when he'd spent 3 months building it the previous summer. "Get your mother and brothers," Frank shouted to Helen. "Right now, don't pack anything, just run." The western sky had gone from bruised purple to a sickly green-black, and Frank could hear it now. That sound, like a freight train bearing down on tracks that didn't exist. Every farmer in tornado country knew that sound, and every farmer who'd heard it and lived never forgot it. Frank's wife Sarah appeared in the doorway with their twin boys, Thomas and William, just 5 years old, clinging to her skirts. Her face had gone pale. She'd heard it too. "Frank, storm cellar, now." They ran, but this story doesn't start on that terrible Wednesday afternoon. It starts 8 months earlier, in July of 1924. When Frank Morrison made a decision that would save his family's life. And that decision came from knowledge passed down through 3 generations of farmers who understood one simple truth. Mother Nature doesn't negotiate, and the only protection you have is what you build yourself. Frank's grandfather had survived the Great Tri-State Tornado of 1883 in Indiana. His father had weathered the devastating storms of 1902 in Missouri. Both men had told Frank the same thing. A farmhouse is shelter from rain and winter cold, but when a real twister comes, wood and nails might as well be paper. The only safety is underground. Most of Frank's neighbors in Hamilton County disagreed. Building a storm cellar meant weeks of back-breaking work. It meant digging through hard clay soil in the blazing summer heat. It meant hauling stones or pouring concrete. It meant taking time away from planting, harvesting, and the 1,000 other tasks that kept a farm running. Many families figured they'd take their chances in the root cellar under the house, or in a corner of the basement if they had one. Frank had different ideas. He'd started digging on July 5th, 1924. The spot he chose was 50 feet from the house, far enough that falling debris wouldn't block the entrance, but close enough to reach in a dead run. The location mattered almost as much as the construction itself. The excavation took 3 weeks. Frank dug down 8 feet, creating a space 10 feet long and 8 feet wide. The soil in southern Illinois was dense clay, which was both a curse and a blessing. Curse because it fought every shovelful. Blessing because clay walls, when properly packed, held their shape and shed water. But Frank didn't trust bare clay walls. He'd seen too many root cellars collapse after heavy rains. Instead, he spent another month hauling limestone blocks from the creek that ran through his property's western edge. Each block weighed between 30 and 50 pounds. He hauled them in a wheelbarrow, sometimes making 20 trips a day in the August heat. His neighbor Carl Hendricks had stopped by one afternoon, leaning on the fence and shaking his head. "Frank, you're going to work yourself into an early grave over a hole in the ground. We've been farming this county for 15 years and never needed anything more than a basement." Frank had straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My grandfather said the same thing in 1882, lost his entire barn the next spring." "That's different," Carl had argued. "That was Indiana. Different weather patterns." Frank had just smiled and gone back to placing stones. The limestone walls went up course by course. Frank used a mixture of clay and lime mortar to bind the blocks, creating walls 18 inches thick. He knew from his father's stories that a tornado could drive a piece of straw through a wooden plank. The walls had to be solid enough to withstand flying debris traveling at speeds no man could outrun. The ceiling presented the biggest challenge. Frank couldn't afford poured concrete, and wooden beams wouldn't survive a direct hit. Instead, he created a hybrid design. He laid heavy oak logs across the opening, then covered them with a layer of sheet metal he'd salvaged from an old barn roof. On top of the metal, he piled 18 inches of packed clay, then topped everything with 2 feet of sod. The result was a ceiling that could support the weight of a horse-drawn wagon. Frank had tested it, and would shed water like a duck's back. The earthen covering also provided insulation, keeping the cellar cool in summer and preventing it from becoming an icebox in winter. The entrance deserved special attention. Frank built double doors from 2-inch oak planks, mounting them on heavy iron hinges he'd bought from the Sears catalog for $2.65. The doors opened outward and upward at a 45-degree angle, which meant debris falling on them would slide off rather than pinning them shut. He installed a heavy wooden bar on the inside that could be dropped into iron brackets, securing the doors against the strongest winds. The final touch was ventilation. Frank drove a 4-inch pipe through the ceiling and extended it 3 feet above ground level, capping it with a metal cone to prevent rain from entering while allowing air to circulate. Without ventilation, the cellar would become a suffocating tomb in minutes. By late September, the storm cellar was complete. Frank had spent nearly 4 months of labor and $37 in materials. His savings account was lighter, and his hands bore new scars from hauling stone and working wood. But he had something most of his neighbors didn't: a fortress that could withstand nature's worst fury. Sarah had understood, even if the neighbors hadn't. She'd grown up in Kansas, where tornado season was as regular as harvest, and she'd lost an aunt to a twister in 1918. She'd helped Frank stock the cellar with emergency supplies, a kerosene lantern with extra fuel, a first aid kit with bandages and iodine, wool blankets sealed in canvas bags to keep them dry, a jug of drinking water that they replaced monthly, and a tin box with matches wrapped in oilcloth. They practiced. Once a month, Frank would call out, "Storm cellar drill," and the entire family would race from wherever they were on the farm to the cellar doors. Sarah timed them with the kitchen clock. Their best time was 43 seconds from Frank's shout to all 5 family members underground with the doors barred. The neighbors had laughed about that too. "Frank Morrison's running tornado drills like he's training for the army," they'd say at church socials. But Frank didn't care. His grandfather's stories had taught him that survival wasn't about luck. It was about preparation. Winter had passed quietly. Spring planting season arrived, and the storm cellar sat unused through March and into early April. Frank began to wonder if maybe the neighbors were right. Maybe he had wasted 4 months of labor and nearly $40 on unnecessary precautions. Then came that Wednesday afternoon in March 18th, 1925. The tri-state tornado, as history would later name it, began forming over the Missouri Ozarks around 1 o'clock that afternoon. Frank Morrison knew nothing about what was brewing 90 miles to the west. He was focused on preparing his fields for spring planting, walking his property line to check for winter damage to his fences. The first sign of trouble was the temperature. At 2 o'clock, it was 63 degrees. By 2:30, it had climbed to 71. By 3 o'clock, the thermometer outside Sarah's kitchen window read 78 degrees. Unseasonably warm for mid-March, and the air felt heavy, almost liquid. Frank had learned to read weather the way some men read newspapers. The warming trend combined with the strange stillness meant instability. Somewhere, hot air and cold air were colliding, and when that happened in spring, bad things followed. He'd headed back toward the house around 3:15, planning to check the barometer his father had given him as a wedding present. The instrument was old but accurate, and Frank trusted its readings more than his own instincts. That's when Helen had come running about the chickens. Animals knew. Dogs would whine and pace. Horses would refuse to enter their stalls. Cattle would cluster together, facing away from the approaching danger. And chickens would abandon their normal behavior entirely, seeking shelter in unusual places or huddling in tight groups far from their coops. Frank had grabbed Helen's hand and started for the house. But one glance at the western sky had changed his destination. The clouds weren't just dark. They were rotating, a massive wall of black-green chaos that seemed to devour the horizon. And that sound, that terrible freight train roar, was growing louder by the second. Sarah had appeared with the twins and Frank had pointed at the storm cellar. No discussion needed. They'd practiced this. The family ran. Sarah reached the doors first and yanked them open. The wooden bar clattered against the stone wall inside. Helen scrambled down the earthen steps Frank had carved into the wall, followed by the twins. Sarah went next, and Frank came last, pulling the doors shut above him and dropping the heavy bar into place just as the first blast of wind hit. Inside the cellar, the kerosene lantern cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls. The air smelled of earth and stone and the faint metallic tang of the lantern's fuel. Frank counted heads automatically. Sarah, Helen, Thomas, William, himself. All 5 present and accounted for. Above them, the roar intensified. It no longer sounded like a train. It sounded like the world ending. The cellar doors rattled against their hinges. Dust sifted down from the ceiling where the oak logs met the limestone walls. The ventilation pipe whistled like a demented flute as wind screamed across its opening. Thomas and William buried their faces in Sarah's skirts, and Helen gripped Frank's hand hard enough to hurt. Frank knew the construction was sound. He'd built those walls, stone by stone. He'd tested the ceiling with wagon loads of rock. He'd secured those doors with iron brackets sunk 6 inches into solid oak. The cellar had been engineered for exactly this moment, but knowing and believing are different things when the earth itself shakes. The roar reached a pitch that made Frank's ears ring. Something massive slammed into the ground directly above them. Probably a tree, maybe part of the barn. The ceiling held. More impacts followed, a drumbeat of destruction that seemed to go on forever. Debris hammered the doors. The wooden bar held firm in its brackets, but Frank moved to brace it anyway, putting his shoulder against the oak and adding his own strength to the hinges. Sarah had started singing. Rock of Ages, her voice steady despite the chaos above. Helen joined in, then the twins, their small voices barely audible above the storm's fury. Frank didn't sing, but he listened, and the sound of his family's voices reminded him why he'd spent 4 months digging through clay and hauling limestone in the summer heat. The tornado's core passed directly over them. Frank had read accounts from survivors of other twisters, and they all described the same thing. A moment of terrible pressure that made your ears pop and your chest feel crushed, followed by an eerie silence that lasted just seconds before the rear wall of the funnel arrived with renewed violence. It happened exactly as described. The pressure hit like a physical blow. Frank's ears popped so hard they hurt. Thomas cried out, and William started to wail. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. No wind, no roar. Just the sound of the family breathing in the darkness of their underground fortress. "Stay down," Frank ordered. "It's not over." 5 seconds later, the rear wall hit. More impacts, more shaking, more dust raining from the ceiling. But Frank knew the worst had passed. The rear wall of a tornado carries less power than the leading edge. They'd survived the strongest part. 3 minutes after the silence, the roaring began to fade. The impacts became less frequent. The pressure in Frank's ears normalized. The whistling from the ventilation pipe dropped in pitch and volume. 5 minutes after that, the world went quiet. Frank waited another 10 minutes before moving from his position, bracing the door. You couldn't trust the silence. Tornadoes sometimes came in groups, or the same funnel could drop and rise and drop again. He'd heard stories from his grandfather about people who emerged too soon and got caught by a second strike. But finally, when the quiet had lasted long enough and no new sounds emerged, Frank lifted the wooden bar and pushed against the doors. They didn't open. Something heavy was blocking them from the outside. Frank pushed harder, putting his full weight into it. The doors moved an inch, then 2, then stopped. Through the narrow gap, he could see gray daylight and smell smoke. "Stay here," he told Sarah. Then to Helen, "Help me push." Together, Frank and his 9-year-old daughter shoved against the doors. Whatever was blocking them shifted, scraping against the door's surface. More pressure. The object moved. Suddenly, the doors flew open, and Frank nearly tumbled out onto the ground. The object that had been blocking them was his barn door, just the door. The barn itself was gone. Frank climbed out of the cellar and stood in what used to be his farmyard. Sarah and the children emerged behind him, and they all stood together, staring at the devastation. The farmhouse was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The entire structure had been lifted from its foundation and scattered across 3 acres. Frank could see his kitchen stove lying on its side, 200 feet from where the house had stood. Sarah's china cabinet, miraculously intact, sat upright in the middle of the cornfield. The children's beds, the dining table, the wood-burning heater, all of it spread across the landscape like a child's toys knocked from a shelf. The barn was completely gone. So was the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the tool shed, and the outhouse. Frank's wagon had been smashed into kindling. His plow was wrapped around a tree trunk like a ribbon. Every building on the Morrison farm had been obliterated, except one. The storm cellar doors still stood at their 45-degree angle, anchored to their limestone walls. The earthen mound that covered the structure showed a few new gouges where debris had struck, but the integrity was intact. 50 feet from where the house had been, Frank's hand-built fortress had weathered the most powerful tornado in American history without so much as a crack in its walls. Frank turned in a slow circle, taking in the destruction. To the east, he could see that Carl Hendrick's farm had suffered similar devastation. The house was rubble, the barn was matchsticks. To the west, the Johnson place looked like it had been fed through a grinder, but he couldn't see any people. No movement from the Hendricks farm, no signs of life at the Johnsons. "Frank," Sarah said softly, gripping his arm. She was looking at the same thing he was. "Take the children back into the cellar," Frank said. "Bar the door from inside. I'm going to check on the neighbors." "Frank, bar the door," he repeated. "I'll knock 3 times when I come back. Don't open it for anyone else." He kissed her quickly, then started across the field toward Carl Hendrick's property. What Frank found in the next 2 hours would haunt him for the rest of his life. Carl Hendricks and his wife Martha had taken shelter in their basement when the tornado struck. The house had collapsed on top of them. Frank and 3 other neighbors spent an hour digging through the wreckage before they found Carl, alive but badly injured, his leg crushed under a fallen beam. Martha was alive too, unconscious but breathing. They had survived but barely. The Johnsons hadn't been as lucky. The entire family, Robert, his wife Anne, and their 3 children, had been in the house when it was destroyed. Frank helped pull their bodies from the debris. The children were 7, 5, and 3 years old. By nightfall, word had spread through Hamilton County. 19 people were dead in their immediate area. Dozens more were injured. Every farm for miles had been damaged or destroyed. The tornado had cut a path of devastation 3/4 of a mile wide, and it had traveled over 200 miles from Missouri through Illinois into Indiana. When Frank finally made it back to his own farm, he knocked 3 times on the storm cellar doors. Sarah opened them immediately. The children were asleep on the blankets, exhausted from fear and crying. Sarah took one look at Frank's face and knew he'd seen death. They didn't talk about it that night. Frank was too numb, and Sarah was too grateful that her family had survived. They all slept in the storm cellar, surrounded by limestone walls and earth, while the spring wind blew cold across the devastated landscape above. The next morning, help began arriving from towns that had been spared. The Red Cross set up stations. Neighbors who still had homes opened their doors to those who didn't. Frank's family stayed in the storm cellar for 3 days, until Sarah's brother arrived from Champaign with a wagon and supplies. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The tri-state tornado had killed 695 people and injured over 2,000. It had destroyed 15,000 homes. It had traveled 219 miles in 3.5 hours, making it the longest-track tornado in recorded history. Wind speeds had exceeded 300 miles per hour. Entire towns had been wiped from the map. In Hamilton County, every single farm had been damaged, but only one family had survived uninjured, their shelter completely intact. Frank Morrison's storm cellar became famous in southern Illinois. Farmers came from 3 counties to examine the construction. They measured the wall thickness, studied the ceiling design, examined the door mounting system. Frank showed them everything, explaining the limestone blocks from the creek bed, the 18-inch walls, the hybrid ceiling with oak logs and sheet metal and earth, the 45-degree door angle. Within 6 months, 23 storm cellars based on Frank's design were under construction in Hamilton County alone. The number spread to neighboring counties. By 1927, variations of the Morrison storm cellar design were being built across the tornado belt from Texas to Ohio. The Red Cross included diagrams of Frank's design in their disaster preparedness materials. The University of Illinois sent an engineer to study the structure and write a technical paper on its construction methods. Frank spent dozens of evenings that year sitting at neighbors' kitchen tables, or more often in their temporary shelters, drawing diagrams and explaining the principles his grandfather had taught him about building for survival. Carl Hendricks was one of the first to build a new cellar. His leg had healed, though he walked with a permanent limp. When Frank came by to help with the excavation, Carl had gripped his shoulder and said, "I should have listened to you last summer. I should have helped you dig instead of making jokes." Frank had just nodded and picked up a shovel. There was no point in saying, "I told you so," to a man who'd nearly lost his life and had lost his home. The Morrison family rebuilt their farmhouse that summer. It was smaller than the original and simpler, because they'd lost almost everything and money was tight. But it was home, and 50 feet from the back porch, the storm cellar doors still stood at their 45-degree angle, weathered oak over limestone walls, ready for the next time Mother Nature came calling. Frank never regretted the 4 months he'd spent building that cellar. The $37 he'd invested had purchased something more valuable than any crop he'd ever harvested: his family's survival. The knowledge that had been passed down from his grandfather had proven itself in the most terrible way possible, and Frank made sure to pass that knowledge forward to anyone who would listen, because in tornado country, a farmer's greatest crop isn't corn or wheat or soybeans. It's preparation. It's the willingness to invest time and labor and money into something you pray you'll never need, but know you eventually will. It's understanding that Mother Nature doesn't care about your planting schedule or your budget or how tired you are after a long day's work. She'll come when she comes, and the only choice you have is whether you'll be ready. That Wednesday in March, Frank Morrison had been ready, and because he was ready, Sarah, Helen, Thomas, and William Morrison were alive to see another spring, another planting season, another harvest. The house could be rebuilt, the barn could be replaced, the livestock could be repurchased, but family was irreplaceable. And family was what Frank had saved with 18-inch limestone walls, oak logs, sheet metal, 2 feet of packed earth, and the wisdom of 3 generations who understood one fundamental truth. When the sky turns green and the air goes still, and you hear that terrible freight train roar, there's no negotiating with what's coming. There's only the shelter you built when the skies were clear, and the work seemed excessive and the neighbors thought you were wasting your time. Frank Morrison's storm cellar still stands today, over 90 years later, on a farm in southern Illinois. The original oak doors have been replaced and modern vents have been added, but the limestone walls remain exactly as Frank built them in the summer of 1924. The current owners of the property maintain it as a historical landmark and emergency shelter, a testament to one man's determination to protect his family and the traditional knowledge that made that protection possible. The tri-state tornado of 1925 changed how rural Americans thought about tornado preparedness. Storm cellars became standard features on farms across the Midwest and South. Designs improved and materials evolved, but the basic principle remained the same: solid walls, strong doors, underground construction, and enough room for a family to shelter in safety. Frank Morrison lived another 42 years after that terrible Wednesday. He saw his children grow up, get married, and have children of their own. He taught his sons and daughters how to build storm cellars, just as his grandfather had taught him. And every spring when the sky turned that particular shade of green and the air grew still, Frank Morrison felt a moment of gratitude for a grandfather he'd never met, but whose wisdom had saved his life. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about Frank Morrison and the storm cellar that saved his family during the devastating tri-state tornado of 1925, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories about American agricultural history and the incredible ingenuity of farming families. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and share it with anyone who appreciates the wisdom and determination of our rural heritage. This video is inspired by actual events and the real experiences of American farming families during the tornado outbreaks of the early 20th century. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or communities. Frank Morrison is a representative character who reflects the experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, built storm cellars using traditional knowledge passed down through generations and saved their families' lives through preparation and understanding of severe weather. Their stories of survival, loss, and resilience deserve to be remembered and honored.